You don't have a thinking problem, you have an overthinking problem. And the more you try to solve it, the worse it becomes. Because overthinking doesn't come from a lack of answers. It comes from a lack of certainty. And your mind is trying to find something that does not exist. Most people believe overthinking is a sign of intelligence. They believe that if they think long enough, analyze deeply enough, and consider every possible outcome, they will eventually find clarity. But the opposite is true. The more you think, the more confused you become. Because overthinking is not solving problems, it is multiplying them. Every thought creates another possibility. Every possibility creates another doubt. Every doubt creates another question. And before you realize it, your mind is trapped in a loop that feels productive, but leads nowhere. This is why overthinking feels exhausting, not because thinking is difficult, but because your mind never reaches a conclusion. It keeps searching, keeps analyzing, keeps replaying. You replay conversations in your head. You replay decisions you have already made. You replay moments that have already passed, trying to find a better outcome that no longer exists. And without realizing it, you become stuck in a cycle of mental repetition. You are not thinking, you are replaying, and you are trying to control something that has already happened. The Stoics understood this long before modern psychology. They recognized that the mind has a tendency to wander beyond reality, to imagine situations that have not happened, to predict outcomes that cannot be predicted, to try and control what cannot be controlled. And in doing so, it creates its own suffering. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. And overthinking is the perfect example of this. Because most of the things you worry about do not exist. They are possibilities, not realities. Overthinking is not caused by reality, it is caused by your interpretation of reality. Think about the last time you overthought something. Was the situation itself overwhelming, or was it the number of possibilities your mind created around it? You imagine what could go wrong. You imagine what people might think. You imagine what might happen next. And suddenly a simple situation becomes complicated. Because your mind is no longer dealing with one reality. It is dealing with dozens of imagined ones. And here's the truth most people never realize. Overthinking is not a thinking problem. It is a control problem. Your mind is trying to control the future. It is trying to predict every outcome, avoid every mistake, prepare for every possible scenario. But the future has never been predictable, and it never will be. So the more you try to control it, the more anxious you become. This is why overthinking and anxiety are so closely connected, because both are attempts to control uncertainty. The anxious mind wants certainty. It wants guarantees. It wants to know that everything will be okay. But life does not offer guarantees, it offers uncertainty. And when your mind refuses to accept that, it begins to spiral. You think more. You analyze more. You try to solve what cannot be solved. And the result is always the same. More thinking, more confusion, more anxiety. The Stoics approached this differently. They did not try to eliminate uncertainty, they accepted it. Because once uncertainty is accepted, overthinking loses its purpose. If you cannot control the outcome, there is nothing to overanalyze. If you cannot predict the future, there is nothing to solve. This does not make you passive, it makes you focused. Because instead of trying to control everything, you focus on what you can control. Your actions, your effort, your response. And suddenly the mind becomes quieter. But there is another layer to overthinking that most people ignore. Fear. Overthinking is often disguised as thinking. But underneath it, there is fear. Fear of making the wrong decision, fear of being judged, fear of failure, fear of uncertainty. Your mind believes that if it thinks long enough, it can avoid these fears. But thinking does not remove fear, it feeds it. Because every new possibility creates a new fear. And so the cycle continues. More thinking, more fear, more confusion, until you feel stuck, unable to decide, unable to act. And this is where overthinking becomes dangerous. Because it stops action, you delay decisions, you hesitate, you wait for clarity that never arrives. But clarity does not come from thinking. It comes from action. Most people have this backwards. They believe they need clarity before they act. But in reality, they need to act to gain clarity. Because action gives feedback. Thinking only creates possibilities, and possibilities are endless. That is why overthinking never ends, because there is always another possibility to consider, another outcome to imagine, another scenario to analyze. If you allow your mind to continue like this, it will never stop. So the question becomes, how do you break the cycle? The answer is not to think better. The answer is to think less. Not by forcing your mind to stop, but by shifting your focus. Instead of asking, what is the perfect decision? Ask, what is the next step? Because progress does not require perfection. It requires movement. And movement breaks overthinking. Action interrupts the loop. The moment you act, your mind shifts from imagination to reality. And reality is always simpler than imagination. There is another transformation that happens when you begin to control overthinking. You stop living inside your head, and you start living in reality. And most people spend more time thinking about life than actually living it. They analyze every situation, they question every decision, they replay every mistake. But in doing so, they miss the present moment. They are physically present, but mentally somewhere else. And over time, this disconnect grows. The more you live inside your mind, the less you experience real life. But when overthinking begins to fade, something changes. Your attention returns to the present. Your focus becomes sharper. Your mind becomes quieter, and life begins to feel simpler. This is where true control begins. Not control over the world, but control over your mind. Because the person who cannot control their thoughts will always feel overwhelmed. But the person who learns to step back from them gains clarity. They begin to see thoughts for what they are. Not commands, not truths, just mental events that come and go. And once you stop identifying with every thought, they begin to lose their power. The goal is not to eliminate thinking. The goal is to stop being controlled by it, to observe without reacting, to think without spiraling, to act without hesitation. Because once you reach this point, something powerful happens. Your mind becomes a tool, not a prison. And when your mind is no longer working against you, everything changes. Decisions become easier. Action becomes natural. Confidence begins to grow. Because confidence does not come from knowing everything. It comes from being able to handle uncertainty. Mastering your mind does not mean you will never overthink again. It means overthinking no longer controls you. It appears. But it does not consume you. It speaks. But it does not decide for you. And that is the difference between a reactive mind and a disciplined one. One is controlled by thought. The other controls it. Mastering your emotions does not remove the challenges of life. You will still face uncertainty. You will still face difficulty, but it transforms how you face them. And that transformation changes everything. Overthinking also creates an illusion of progress. It feels like you are doing something useful. It feels like you are working toward a solution. But in reality, nothing is changing. You are not moving forward. You are not making a decision. You are not taking action. You are simply staying in the same place, repeating the same thoughts. This is why overthinking can be so dangerous, because it feels productive even when it is not. You convince yourself that more thinking will eventually lead to clarity, but clarity does not come from thinking endlessly. It comes from reaching a point where thinking stops and action begins. The longer you stay in your head, the further you move away from real progress. Because real progress only exists in action, not in thought. There is also a deeper psychological pattern behind overthinking that most people never notice. The need for certainty. Your mind is constantly trying to eliminate risk. It wants to make the perfect decision. It wants to avoid failure. It wants to guarantee a positive outcome. But perfection does not exist, and certainty is an illusion. Every decision you make in life involves some level of uncertainty. No amount of thinking can remove that. No amount of analysis can guarantee success. So when your mind tries to find the perfect answer, it gets stuck. Because the perfect answer does not exist. And the more it searches, the more frustrated it becomes. This is where overthinking turns into paralysis. You feel stuck between options, unable to decide, unable to move, because every option contains uncertainty, and your mind refuses to accept it. This is why people who overthink often struggle with simple decisions. Not because the decisions are difficult, but because their mind is trying to eliminate all risk. And that is impossible. So instead of choosing, they delay. Instead of acting, they wait. They wait for the moment when everything feels clear, when everything feels certain, when everything feels safe. But that moment never arrives because life does not work that way. The Stoics understood this. They did not try to eliminate uncertainty. They trained themselves to act in spite of it. They accepted that outcomes are never fully within their control. And because of that, they focused only on what they could control: their effort, their decisions, their actions. This shift removes the need for overthinking, because once you accept that you cannot control the outcome, there is no reason to obsess over it. You simply choose the best option available and act. Another reason overthinking becomes so powerful is because of how the brain processes negative outcomes. Your mind is naturally wired to focus on potential threats. It is constantly scanning for what could go wrong. This was useful for survival. But in modern life, it often works against you. Because instead of protecting you, it traps you in constant anticipation of problems. You imagine worst-case scenarios. You expect things to go wrong. You prepare for failure before it has even happened. And this creates a cycle of fear. The more you think, the more threats you imagine. The more threats you imagine, the more you think. And the cycle continues. Breaking this cycle requires a different approach. Not more thinking, but less attachment to thought. Instead of engaging with every thought that appears, you learn to observe it. You notice it, but you do not follow it. You allow it to exist without reacting to it. This is where control begins. Because the moment you stop engaging with every thought, your mind begins to quiet down. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer dominate your attention. They pass, instead of pulling you into endless loops. There is a powerful shift that happens when you reach this point. You stop believing every thought. You stop treating every idea as important. You begin to realize that not every thought deserves your attention. And this changes everything, because overthinking depends on attention. It feeds on your focus. The more attention you give it, the stronger it becomes. The less attention you give it, the weaker it becomes. This is why action is so effective, because action redirects your attention. Instead of focusing on imagined outcomes, you focus on real movement. Instead of analyzing possibilities, you engage with reality. And reality is always simpler than imagination. It is always more manageable. It is always more clear. Over time, this creates a new pattern. Instead of thinking first and acting later, you begin acting first and thinking as you go. You stop waiting for certainty. You stop waiting for clarity. You stop waiting for the perfect moment. And you begin moving forward. This does not mean you become reckless. It means you become decisive. You accept that mistakes are part of the process. You accept that uncertainty is unavoidable, and you move anyway. This is where confidence begins to grow. Not from thinking, but from action, because every time you act despite uncertainty, you prove something to yourself. You prove that you can handle the outcome. You prove that you do not need certainty to move forward. And this reduces the need to overthink. Eventually, something changes. The mind that once felt overwhelming becomes quieter. The constant loops begin to fade. The need to analyze everything disappears. And in its place, something stronger appears. Clarity. Not the clarity that comes from thinking everything through, but the clarity that comes from experience, from action, from moving forward despite uncertainty. And this is the key. You do not escape overthinking by solving every problem in your mind. You escape it by stepping out of your mind entirely and returning to reality. If you are working to strengthen your mind and take control of your thoughts, consider subscribing to The Mind Refined. Because in a world where most people are controlled by their minds, the one who masters it becomes powerful.